Commander Zara Vexthani watched the human stumble through the airlock with barely concealed amusement. The creature was tall by galactic standards, though not impressively so, and moved with what appeared to be the awkward uncertainty of someone completely out of their element. His clothing was simple, almost primitive, a basic jumpsuit that looked like it had been hastily assembled from spare parts. Most telling of all, he carried no visible weapons, wore no armor, and displayed none of the technological augmentations that marked a serious spacefarer. Marcus Chen, the human, introduced himself with what Zara's translator identified as a nervous smile. "I'm here about the navigator position." Zara's four eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of her growing skepticism. The Kytherian's natural ability to read electromagnetic signatures told her that this human's neural activity was remarkably calm for someone supposedly seeking employment on one of the most dangerous trade routes in the galaxy. Either he was incredibly naive, or there was more to him than his appearance suggested. "Navigator?" Her voice carried the harmonic undertones that made most species instinctively respectful when speaking to a Kytherian. The posting specifically mentioned that we would be traveling through the void reaches. "You do understand what that means, don't you?" Marcus nodded, his expression remaining unchanged. Uncharted space beyond the galactic rim. High probability of encountering hostile entities. Limited backup options if something goes wrong. He paused, then added almost casually, "Sounds straightforward enough." The other crew members exchanged glances. Jackson, her Vraxian weapons specialist, made a sound that roughly translated to derisive laughter. His scaled hide rippled with patterns that indicated he found the human's confidence either amusing or insulting. Possibly both. "Straightforward," Jackson repeated, his translator giving his words a mocking edge. "Tell me, Softskin, how many vessels have you navigated beyond the rim?" "This would be my first time," Marcus admitted without any apparent embarrassment. Zara felt her interest waning rapidly. She had hoped that the human species might offer some unique perspective. Their recent entry into galactic civilization had generated considerable curiosity, but this one seemed disappointingly ordinary. Still, navigators were in short supply, particularly ones willing to venture into genuinely dangerous territory. "Our last navigator," she said carefully, "was eaten by a Shadowmaw 3 systems out from Kepler Station. The one before that disappeared entirely when we encountered a spatial anomaly near the Crying Stars." "Are you certain you want this position?" Marcus considered this for a moment, then shrugged. "Everyone dies eventually. Might as well be doing something interesting when it happens." There was something in his tone that made Zara reconsider her initial assessment. She had heard similar words from career spacers, the kind who had seen enough of the galaxy's wonders and horrors to achieve a certain philosophical detachment from personal danger. But this human claimed to be a beginner. "Very well," she decided. "We'll give you a trial run. 1 standard week, with the understanding that if you prove inadequate, we'll drop you at the nearest civilized world." She gestured toward the ship's central corridor. "Kess will show you to your quarters and explain our navigation systems." Kess, her Altarian engineer, floated forward on his gas-filled appendages. His bioluminescent patches flickered in what Zara recognized as mild curiosity. Unlike Jackson, Kess seemed willing to reserve judgment about their new crew member. As the human followed Kess deeper into the ship, Zara found herself wondering what desperation or foolishness had driven him to seek employment on a vessel bound for the galaxy's most dangerous frontier. In her experience, beings who appeared harmless usually were, and those who were truly dangerous rarely advertised the fact. 3 days into their journey, she began to suspect she might have been wrong on both counts. The first sign came during what should have been a routine hyperspace translation. They were making the jump from the Corvin system to the edge of charted space, a journey that typically required careful calculation and precise timing. Zara had been prepared to guide Marcus through the process, expecting the kind of nervous uncertainty that marked most beginners attempting their first major navigation. Instead, she found him in the navigation chamber, apparently asleep. "Human." Jackson's voice carried a note of outrage that his translator couldn't quite capture. "We translate in 30 minutes and you're sleeping?" Marcus opened his eyes with the unhurried calm of someone waking from a pleasant nap rather than being startled awake. "The calculations are finished," he said simply. "All we have to do is wait for the right moment to initiate." Zara moved to the navigation console and began reviewing his work. What she found made her pause. The route he had plotted was not the standard safe approach she would have expected from a novice. Instead, he had identified a shortcut that would save them nearly 2 days of travel time by using a gravitational slingshot around a neutron star. "This is highly irregular," she said, though she couldn't find any actual errors in his mathematics. "The gravitational stresses alone are well within our structural tolerance," Marcus finished. "I checked the ship's specifications before plotting the course. We'll experience roughly 12% higher acceleration than normal, but nothing problematic." Jackson studied the calculations with growing suspicion. "How did you identify this route?" "It's not in any of the standard navigation databases." "I looked at the star charts and thought about the physics involved," Marcus replied with the tone of someone stating the obvious. "Seemed like a more efficient approach than the standard route." Kess drifted closer to examine the display, his bioluminescent patches shifting to colors that indicated intense interest. "This is sophisticated work," he observed. "The kind of optimization typically performed by veteran navigators with decades of experience." "Mathematics is mathematics," Marcus said with another shrug. "The principles don't change based on how long someone has been applying them." When they executed the translation, Zara had to admit that the human's route worked exactly as he had predicted. The ship emerged from hyperspace precisely where his calculations indicated, having saved significant time and fuel in the process. More unsettling than his accuracy, however, was his complete lack of surprise at the success. He had not hoped his plan would work, he had known it would. The second sign came when they encountered pirates. The attack happened in the frontier zone, a region where law enforcement was minimal and predation was common. 3 ships emerged from the sensor shadow of a dead planet, broadcasting demands for cargo and threatening destruction if their terms weren't met. Zara had dealt with pirates before. Standard procedure was to assess their strength relative to her own ship's capabilities, then either fight, flee, or negotiate based on the tactical situation. What she didn't expect was for Marcus to request permission to handle communications. "You want to talk to pirates?" Jackson asked incredulously. "Soft skin, these aren't merchants interested in negotiation. They're predators who view us as prey." "Everyone can be reasoned with," Marcus replied with the same calm demeanor he had shown since coming aboard. "Sometimes you just need to find the right approach." Against her better judgment, Zara allowed him to open a communication channel. She expected to witness either an embarrassing attempt at diplomacy or a demonstration of human naivety that would require immediate damage control. What happened instead defied her understanding entirely. Marcus spoke to the pirate leader in conversational tones, as if they were discussing the weather. He made no threats, offered no bribes, and showed no fear. He simply talked, asking questions about their operations, their crew, their recent activities. The pirate leader, apparently as confused as Zara by this approach, answered most of the questions. Then, Marcus began offering suggestions. "Your attack formation is interesting," he observed casually. "Though I notice you're leaving your engine signatures exposed to anyone with decent sensors. If your targets had long-range military hardware, they could disable your propulsion before you even knew you were under attack." The pirate leader's response carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "What would you recommend?" "Stagger your approach vectors," Marcus replied, as if he were helping an old friend solve a technical problem. "Use the gravitational interference from that asteroid cluster to mask your heat signatures until you're close enough to ensure tactical superiority." There was a long pause in the communication. When the pirate leader spoke again, his tone had shifted from aggressive confidence to something approaching respect. "You speak like someone with experience in these matters." "Experience is relative," Marcus said. "But tactical principles tend to be universal." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Marcus offering what amounted to a masterclass in space combat tactics disguised as casual conversation. By the time the communication ended, the pirates had withdrawn without demanding any cargo or threatening further violence. More disturbing still, they had thanked Marcus for his advice. "What just happened?" Zara asked once the pirate ships had disappeared into hyperspace. "Avoided a fight," Marcus replied. "Fighting is expensive and dangerous." Much better to find alternatives when possible. You gave pirates tactical advice, Jackson pointed out, his scales displaying patterns that indicated he was reconsidering his assessment of the humans' intelligence. Why would you help them become more effective predators? Because predators who are confident in their abilities are less likely to attack difficult targets, Marcus explained patiently. They'll focus on easier prey. Meanwhile, the tactical improvements I suggested will make them more visible to law enforcement sensors, which means they'll probably be caught within the next few months. Kess's bioluminescent display shifted to colors indicating deep admiration. You manipulated them into improving their methods in ways that will ultimately lead to their capture. I offered helpful suggestions, Marcus corrected. What they do with those suggestions is their choice. That night, as they traveled through hyperspace toward the galactic rim, Zara found herself reviewing everything she thought she knew about their human navigator. His calm competence in situations that should have challenged or frightened a beginner was becoming impossible to ignore. More troubling was the growing realization that his apparent naivety might be the most sophisticated deception she had ever encountered. She had hired what she thought was a desperate novice willing to risk his life for employment. Instead, she seemed to have acquired someone whose casual expertise suggested experience far beyond what his species should possess. The question was whether that experience represented an opportunity or a threat to her mission. In the void reaches, the distinction between the two could determine whether her crew survived their journey or joined the countless others who had disappeared beyond the galaxy's edge. As they approached the boundary of charted space, Zara began to suspect that discovering the answer to that question would prove far more dangerous than anything they might encounter in the unknown regions ahead. The first real test of Marcus's abilities came when they encountered the Devourer swarm. They had been traveling through the void reaches for 6 days, mapping unexplored systems and cataloging potentially valuable resources. The work was routine enough that even Zara had begun to relax, focusing on the commercial possibilities rather than the constant threat of death that typically characterized expeditions beyond the rim. That changed when Kess detected the energy signatures. Commander, the Altarian's voice carried harmonics of deep concern as his bioluminescent patches shifted to warning colors. I'm reading massive biomechanical activity 3 light minutes ahead. The signatures match archived descriptions of Devourer technology. Zara felt her blood chill. The Devourers were legend among spacefaring species, a race of beings that consumed entire worlds, stripping them of all biological matter before moving on to their next target. They had been responsible for the sterilization of at least 12 known systems before disappearing into the galactic void centuries ago. How many ships, she asked, already calculating retreat vectors? That's the problem, Kess replied, his voice becoming more strained. I don't think they're ships. The signatures suggest a single massive organism, possibly biological in nature. It's at least 50 kilometers long. Jackson's scale shifted to patterns indicating battle readiness, though his movements carried an undertone of uncertainty. Can we avoid detection? Negative. We're already inside its sensor perimeter. Kess paused, consulting his instruments. Commander, it's changing course to intercept us. Zara closed her 4 eyes in sequence, a Kytherian gesture indicating deep concentration. Their ship was fast and, well armed for a commercial vessel, but nothing in their arsenal would be effective against a creature of that size. Retreat was their only option, and even that might not be sufficient if the entity proved capable of faster-than-light pursuit. Plot an emergency hyperspace jump, she commanded. Maximum distance, any direction that takes us away from that thing. That might not be wise, Marcus said quietly from the navigation station. Everyone turned to look at the human. Throughout their conversation about imminent death, he had remained focused on his instruments with the same calm attention he showed when calculating routine course corrections. Explain, Zara demanded. The entity isn't following a direct intercept course, Marcus observed, highlighting the creature's movement on the main display. It's adjusting its trajectory to account for our likely escape routes. If we attempt a hyperspace jump now, we'll emerge directly in its path. Jackson studied the projected courses with growing alarm. You're suggesting it can predict our jump coordinates? I'm suggesting it understands our technology well enough to anticipate our tactical options, Marcus corrected. Which means random evasion won't be effective. Zara forced herself to remain calm despite the implications of his analysis. What do you recommend? Marcus considered the question for several moments, his attention divided between the sensor readings and what appeared to be complex calculations on his personal display. When he finally spoke, his tone carried the same casual confidence he had shown when dealing with the pirates. We're going to have to talk to it. The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle hum of the ship's life support systems. Talk to it, Jackson repeated slowly. You want to communicate with a devourer. Communication is usually preferable to conflict, Marcus replied matter-of-factly. Especially when conflict isn't likely to achieve desirable outcomes. Devourers don't communicate, Zara pointed out. They consume. That's literally their defining characteristic according to every historical record we have. Historical records can be incomplete, Marcus said with another shrug. Besides, something that large and sophisticated must have some form of intelligence directing its actions. Intelligence implies the capacity for communication. Kes drifted closer to the communication console, his bioluminescent patches displaying colors that indicated he was intrigued despite his obvious fear. Even if you're correct about its intelligence, we don't have any protocols for communicating with devourer entities. We don't even know if they process information in ways our translators can interpret. Then, we'll have to improvise, Marcus replied, moving to the communication station with the same unhurried confidence he had shown throughout their journey. May I? Zara found herself nodding despite every instinct telling her that attempting communication with a devourer was tantamount to suicide. Perhaps because all their alternatives seemed equally likely to result in death, or perhaps because the human's calm certainty was becoming strangely reassuring. Marcus activated the communication array and began broadcasting on multiple frequencies, using mathematical sequences and basic physical constants that any intelligence should recognize as artificial signals. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, their instruments detected a response. What came through their speakers wasn't voice or any recognizable form of language. Instead, they heard something that sounded like the universe itself breathing, a deep, rhythmic pulse that seemed to resonate through their ship's structure. It's responding, Kes observed unnecessarily, his patches cycling through colors indicating excitement mixed with terror. Marcus listened to the pattern for several minutes, then began modifying their transmission to mirror the entity's rhythm. Gradually, the exchange began to resemble conversation, though whether any actual information was being transmitted remained unclear. Then, the breathing changed, becoming more complex. Harmonics emerged within the basic pattern, creating what almost sounded like music. Marcus responded by incorporating similar harmonics into their transmission, creating an increasingly sophisticated dialogue of mathematical relationships expressed as sound. Are you actually communicating with that thing? Jackson asked, his scales displaying patterns that indicated he was reconsidering fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. I think so, Marcus replied, his attention focused on the communication console. It's definitely intelligent. And curious about us. The exchange continued for nearly an hour, with the mathematical complexity growing steadily more sophisticated. Eventually, the entity transmitted what appeared to be coordinates, followed by a repetition of their earlier greeting sequence. I think it's inviting us to meet, Marcus announced. Meet where? Zara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The coordinates it transmitted. About 200,000 kilometers from its current position. Absolutely not, Jackson declared. Meeting a devourer voluntarily is the definition of suicide. Actually, Kes interjected thoughtfully, if it wanted to consume us, it could have done so already. The fact that it's maintaining distance and attempting communication suggests non-hostile intent. Marcus nodded approvingly. Exactly. Besides, it specifically chose a meeting point that allows us multiple escape routes if the encounter goes badly. Zara considered their options. They could attempt to flee, but Marcus's analysis suggested the entity would anticipate and counter such efforts. They could try to fight, but their weapons would be ineffective against something of that size. Or they could trust their human navigator's inexplicable confidence and accept what might be the first peaceful contact with a devourer in galactic history. If we do this, she said carefully, and you're wrong about its intentions, we'll all be dead within minutes. "If I'm wrong," Marcus replied with characteristic calm, "you'll have plenty of time to reconsider your hiring practices in whatever afterlife your species believes in." Despite the circumstances, Zara found herself almost smiling at his response. "Very well. Set course for the coordinates." The journey to the meeting point felt like the longest 2 hours of Zara's life, though in reality, their approach took less than 30 minutes. As they drew closer, the entity's true size became apparent through their viewports. It was even larger than their sensors had indicated, a biomechanical construct that dwarfed their ship so completely that they felt like bacteria approaching a whale. More unsettling than its size was its beauty. The entity's surface wasn't the dark, threatening carapace she had expected from historical descriptions. Instead, it gleamed with patterns of light that shifted and flowed like living art. Delicate structures extended from its main body like crystalline trees, and bioluminescent displays pulsed in rhythms that seemed to echo the mathematical conversations Marcus had been conducting. "It's magnificent," Kess whispered, his voice filled with awe. "It's a predator," Jackson reminded them, though his scales showed patterns indicating he was also impressed despite himself. As they approached the designated coordinates, the entity extended what appeared to be a docking appendage, a graceful structure that seemed designed to interface with much smaller vessels. Marcus guided them toward it with the precision of someone who had performed such maneuvers countless times before. "Have you ever docked with an unknown alien entity before?" Zara asked. "Not specifically," Marcus admitted. "But the principles are similar to any precision approach. You calculate the relative velocities, account for gravitational effects, and make adjustments as needed." The docking process proceeded smoothly, with the entity's appendage adapting to their ship's configuration in ways that demonstrated remarkable sophistication. Once the connection was secure, their instruments detected atmospheric equalization. The entity was providing a breathable environment for their meeting. "Well," Marcus said, rising from the navigation console with the same casual demeanor he had maintained throughout the encounter, "I suppose we should go see what it wants to discuss." As they prepared to make first contact with a member of one of the galaxy's most feared species, Zara realized that her human navigator had just accomplished something that would be remembered throughout galactic history. He had turned a potential catastrophe into a diplomatic encounter, using nothing more than mathematical communication and unshakable confidence. The question that remained was how a supposed beginner possessed the knowledge and composure to achieve such an impossible outcome. And whether the answers to that question would prove more dangerous than the devourer itself. When they stepped through the airlock into the entity's interior, Zara found herself in a space that defied her expectations once again. Rather than the dark, threatening environment she had anticipated, they entered a chamber filled with soft, warm light. The walls seemed to be grown rather than built, with organic curves and flowing patterns that suggested artistic sensibility rather than purely functional design. The being that greeted them was equally unexpected. Rather than the monstrous predator of galactic legend, they encountered an entity that appeared almost plant-like in its basic structure, though clearly possessed of advanced intelligence. It communicated through patterns of light and harmonics that their translators interpreted as complex mathematical concepts. Through Marcus's continued translation efforts, they learned that the entity called itself a guardian rather than a devourer. Its species had been tasked with maintaining ecological balance in regions beyond the galactic rim, removing corrupted biological matter and preventing the spread of dangerous organisms. The consumption that had led to their fearsome reputation was actually a form of environmental cleanup. More importantly for their immediate situation, the Guardian had been observing their ship since they entered the void reaches. It had detected something unusual about their crew, specifically, energy signatures that didn't match the biological norms for any of their species. When the Guardian's attention focused on Marcus, its lights shifted to patterns that their translator interpreted as profound curiosity mixed with something approaching recognition. The being had questions about the human that Zara suspected would prove very difficult to answer satisfactorily. Questions that suggested Marcus's true nature was far stranger than even she had begun to suspect. As the Guardian began its inquiry, Zara realized that discovering the truth about their navigator might prove more transformative than any treasure they could hope to find in the unexplored regions of space. And possibly more dangerous than anything else they might encounter beyond the galaxy's edge. The Guardian's inquiry began with what seemed like simple questions. Through the complex interplay of light and harmonics that Marcus continued to translate with impossible fluency, the entity asked about their crew composition, their mission objectives, and their species' technological capabilities. Then, it asked Marcus directly what he was. The question hung in the air like a physical presence, and, for the first time since joining their crew, the human appeared to consider his words carefully before responding. "I'm a navigator," he said finally, though even Zara could detect the incomplete nature of that answer. The Guardian's light patterns shifted to configurations that their translator interpreted as gentle disagreement. Through Marcus's ongoing translation, it explained that his energy signature didn't match any known biological pattern. More specifically, it detected quantum resonances that suggested he existed partially outside normal spacetime. "That's impossible," Jackson declared, his scales displaying patterns of confusion and suspicion. "Nothing organic can exist outside normal spacetime. The physics don't allow it." Marcus turned to look at the Vraxian with an expression that might have been amusement. "The physics are more flexible than most species assume. Reality has a lot more room for unusual arrangements than your textbooks suggest." Kess drifted closer, his bioluminescent patches cycling through colors indicating intense curiosity. "Are you saying you're not entirely here? In this dimension?" "I'm saying that here is a more complex concept than most beings realize," Marcus replied. "Consciousness doesn't have to be limited to a single temporal reference frame." Zara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. "Marcus, what exactly are you?" He considered the question for several moments while the Guardian's lights pulsed in patterns that seemed patient but expectant. When he finally answered, his voice carried a note of something that might have been regret. "I'm human," he said. "Just not from when you think I'm from." The silence that followed was broken by Jackson's involuntary hiss of disbelief. "Temporal displacement? That's theoretical technology. Even the most advanced species in the galaxy haven't achieved stable time manipulation." "Humans haven't achieved it either," Marcus admitted. "At least, not the humans you know about. But, humanity's development doesn't follow the same trajectory in every timeline." Through the Guardian's continued communication, they learned that it had encountered Marcus's kind before. Not humans specifically, but beings whose consciousness existed across multiple temporal states simultaneously. The entity called them wanderers, individuals whose awareness spanned different potential futures and who could navigate between timelines with the same ease others traveled between star systems. "You're from the future," Zara said, stating what was becoming obvious despite its impossibility. "I'm from several futures," Marcus corrected. "Most of them aren't particularly pleasant, which is why I spend my time in this era. It's one of the better ones, temporally speaking." Kess's patches had shifted to colors indicating he was processing concepts that strained his understanding of reality. "If you can see multiple timelines, you must know how our mission ends. Whether we succeed or fail. Success and failure are more fluid concepts when you're dealing with temporal multiplicity," Marcus replied. "Every choice creates new potential outcomes. What matters isn't predetermination, but which possibilities you choose to pursue." The Guardian's lights brightened, and, through Marcus's translation, it explained that it had been hoping to encounter a wanderer. The entity's species had been monitoring concerning developments in several nearby galaxies, the emergence of something it called the Hunger, an entity that consumed not just biological matter but the fundamental structure of spacetime itself. Traditional defenses were ineffective against such a threat because it existed in a state of temporal flux, attacking civilizations across multiple timelines simultaneously. Only beings who could perceive and navigate temporal multiplicity could potentially develop countermeasures. "You're asking us to help fight something that attacks entire timelines?" Jackson asked, his scales displaying patterns that indicated he was questioning the wisdom of this entire encounter. "I'm not asking anything," Marcus replied calmly. "The Guardian is sharing information about a threat that will eventually reach this region of space. What we do with that information is our choice." Zara found herself studying the human with new eyes, trying to reconcile the casual, apparently naive crew member she had hired with the temporal entity he was revealing himself to be. "Why didn't you tell us what you were from the beginning? Would you have hired me if I'd introduced myself as a consciousness from multiple possible futures?" Marcus asked reasonably. most species have difficulty accepting the existence of straightforward alien life. Temporal multiplicity tends to cause existential crises. And, you needed to be on this ship specifically? Kes asked. I needed to be in this region of space at this time, Marcus explained. Your ship was the most convenient transportation. Plus, you were heading in the right direction to encounter the Guardian. The entity's lights pulsed in what their translator interpreted as agreement. Through Marcus's ongoing communication, it explained that it had been subtly influencing events to ensure this meeting would occur. The pirates they had encountered, for instance, had been guided to that location by carefully placed rumors of valuable cargo. You manipulated us, Jackson accused, though his tone carried more curiosity than anger. I influenced probability, Marcus corrected. There's a difference. You all made your own choices based on information that was available to you. I simply ensured that certain options were more likely to present themselves. As the conversation continued, the scope of what Marcus was revealing became increasingly staggering. He described a future where humanity had developed technologies that allowed consciousness to exist independently of linear time, enabling individuals to experience multiple potential timelines simultaneously. Most humans who achieved this state eventually lost their connection to any single timeline, becoming unable to function in normal spacetime. Marcus was one of the few who had learned to maintain coherent identity across temporal boundaries while still being able to interact with beings locked in linear time. This made him uniquely valuable as an agent for preventing catastrophic events that could damage the fundamental structure of reality. The hunger, he explained, is what remains of a species that tried to achieve temporal transcendence without proper safeguards. They became trapped in a state of existential need, requiring them to consume the timeline structure of other realities to maintain their existence. The Guardian's lights shifted to patterns indicating deep concern as it shared additional information. The hunger had already consumed several smaller galaxies, and its expansion was accelerating. Current projections suggested it would reach their region of space within the next few centuries. Centuries, Zara repeated. That's multiple lifetimes away. Why should we be concerned about something that distant? Because, Marcus said quietly, I've seen the timelines where we don't prepare for it in advance. They don't end well for anyone. Through the Guardian's communication, they learned that preparations for defending against the hunger required cooperation between multiple species across vast distances. The entity itself was part of a network of Guardians working to strengthen reality's structure in regions where the hunger's advance could be slowed or stopped. What they needed was a way to communicate their warnings to the galaxy's major civilizations without causing the kind of panic that would lead to destructive conflicts. Most species weren't ready to accept the existence of timeline-spanning threats, much less coordinate effective responses to them. That's where you come in, Marcus told his crewmates. You're ideal ambassadors for this kind of information. Experienced enough to be taken seriously, but not so connected to major political structures that your warnings would be dismissed as propaganda. Kes's patches had shifted to colors indicating thoughtful consideration. You want us to become messengers for a threat most species will consider fictional. I want you to choose whether to become messengers, Marcus corrected. The choice is entirely yours. But, I thought you deserved to know what's actually at stake in these unexplored regions. Jackson studied the human with new respect, his scales displaying patterns indicating he was reconsidering everything he thought he knew about the nature of existence. If you can see multiple timelines, you must know whether we'll agree to help. I know the probabilities, Marcus admitted. But, probability isn't certainty. Every moment creates new potential futures, and consciousness has the power to select which possibilities become reality. The Guardian's lights pulsed in what seemed like approval, and, through Marcus's translation, it offered to share additional information about the hunger and the network of defenses being prepared across multiple galaxies. The knowledge would be dangerous. Understanding the true nature of the threat carried the risk of temporal displacement for beings whose consciousness wasn't adapted to handle such concepts. But, it would also provide them with the tools needed to help coordinate a defense that might preserve not just their galaxy, but the fundamental structure of spacetime itself. As Zara considered the choice they were being offered, she realized that her simple trading mission had become something far more significant. They had been given the opportunity to participate in what might be the most important endeavor in the history of conscious life. More importantly, they had discovered that the human she had dismissed as a naive beginner was actually something unprecedented, a guide whose knowledge spanned multiple timelines and whose presence offered hope for challenges that would have been impossible to face alone. The question now was whether they possessed the courage to accept responsibility for knowledge that could transform their understanding of reality itself. And whether they could trust a being whose true nature was so far beyond their experience that even beginning to comprehend it required abandoning most of their assumptions about the nature of existence. Looking at Marcus, at the temporal wanderer who had disguised himself as a simple navigator, Zara made her choice. Some opportunities were too important to refuse, regardless of the risks involved. "Tell us what we need to know," she said. The Guardian's lights brightened to an almost overwhelming intensity, and Marcus smiled with what appeared to be genuine relief. "Thank you," he said simply. "Now we can begin the real work." As the Guardian began sharing knowledge that would forever change their understanding of the universe, Zara reflected on how profoundly wrong her initial assessment had been. She had thought Marcus was a harmless beginner seeking simple employment. Instead, she had hired hope itself in human form, a being whose existence proved that consciousness could transcend the limitations of linear time and whose presence offered the possibility that even the most devastating threats could be overcome through cooperation and understanding. The galaxy would never look the same to any of them again. And, perhaps, if they succeeded in their new mission, it would continue to exist in a form that future generations could recognize and cherish. In the end, that was all anyone could hope for, the chance to leave the universe a little better than they had found it, regardless of how impossible the task might seem at the beginning.